Here. So there's a lot to talk about Purim, many different angles. I guess the best place to start is to start by saying that in some ways, Purim, let's make another introduction. Somehow or another, Purim is, in some sense, the greatest holiday. Why am I saying this? Even though it's not in the Bible, it's not in the Torah, because it, of course, commemorates an event that happened after the conclusion of the 5 books of Moses, certainly, but it was recorded in the Tanakh, in the Bible, in the writings, in the Ketuvim. The book of Esther was included there. And that's why it's considered a rabbinic holiday, but it's not a biblical holiday because it's not in the 5 books of Moses. But nevertheless, we see that Purim, in some sense, is a greater holiday than all other holidays. Where do you see this? You see this about the joy, because we'll talk about this maybe perhaps a little later, but there's a fascinating Talmudic statement. And the Talmud says that on Purim, everybody is supposed to, a person has an obligation, a person has an obligation to get drunk with wine on Purim until you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Now, I tried this once. It takes a lot of alcohol not to know the difference between blessed is Haman and cursed, and blessed, I'm already drunk. I'm already confusing. Blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. It takes a lot of alcohol. So before we even get into why that's a value and why that's a thing, but you see that there is, basically they're saying the joy has to be in a way that's beyond all limitations. In fact, the Talmud says that when it comes to other holidays, the rabbis are not too happy. You're supposed to celebrate on the holidays and be happy, but they would send out people to make sure that the joy doesn't get out of hand. People don't do crazy things and things that are not modest. That's what it says in the Talmud about all other holidays. However, when it comes to the holiday of Purim, all boundaries are off. So we could talk about that later, why that's a value. But you see that there's something unique about Purim more than all the other holidays in the sense that the joy is more intense. So why is that? Where does it come from? So a good place to start would be to look at a piece of Talmud, and that's what I'm going to start with. And this piece of Talmud makes a fascinating statement. It says that in some ways, the Jewish people during the era of the decree of Purim, that is when they actually accepted the Torah. So in some ways, we didn't get the Torah at Sinai 3,300 years ago. We got the Torah in Shushan in Persia, how many years ago? About 2,400 years ago. Why would you say that? Says the Talmud, at Sinai, we didn't really have a choice. God basically forced the Torah upon us. We'll see what that means. I'm going to read the Talmud inside and try to explain that. But in some sense, you have no choice. God forced us to accept the Torah. 1,000 years later, almost 1,000 years later in Persia, there was no one forcing us to accept the Torah. To the contrary, there was a decree that whoever is Jewish, whoever doesn't bow to Haman, will be killed. So there was an incentive to check out. There's an incentive to convert. And yet the Jewish people remained loyal to God. Says the Talmud, and it quotes a verse in the Megillah, in the scroll of Esther, and it sort of reinterprets it in a little bit of a way, sort of reinterprets in a creative way, but it says, when the Jews accepted the Torah, they didn't accept it at Sinai. Sinai they accepted it because they had no choice. But when they really accepted it, when they had an option to check out, and when the incentives were aligned for them to abandon Judaism, and they didn't, that is when they accepted it. So now we think of Purim on a much deeper way. It's not just a holiday that they tried to kill us. God saved us, so let's eat, which is basically the story of many Jewish holidays. No, that's just a superficial interpretation. The deeper interpretation is that it's really a celebration of the true acceptance of the Torah. When the Jewish people accepted the Torah, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, despite the great incentive to check out and save your life. So that's a Talmudic point, and that begins to give us an indication about the spiritual power of Purim. So that's our starting point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the Talmud. Interestingly enough, this does not appear in the Talmud, in the tractate of Megillah, which is the tractate of named Megillah is the scroll of Esther, which is the tractate that discusses the laws of Purim. Rather, it appears in the tractate of Shabbat, in the section that discusses the giving of the Torah. So when the Torah was given, when the Talmud discusses the giving of the Torah, the Talmud also discusses the shortcomings of the acceptance. It wasn't really acceptance. God put a gun to our head, so to speak. So let's read the Talmud and let's see if we can get into it. We can get into the Purim spirit. I'm just thinking that I have a coffee here, but Chabad also gave us a vodka brand that has vodka and coffee together. And that's actually a pretty creative idea. Maybe that's the better coffee for Purim morning, but who knows? We'll see. Still have to drive around, so we'll save that for later. Okay, fine. Let's share the Talmud. So this appears, you see Shabbat, tractate Shabbat, page 88a. That is the sugya, that is the discussion about the giving of the Torah. So there, if you look at the Talmud over there, the Talmud is addressing a verse in the Torah describing the giving of the Torah, where it says that the Jewish people stood under the mountain. Now, under the mountain in English doesn't work because you don't stand under a mountain. But in Hebrew, you could say under a mountain. Under a mountain meaning at the foot of the mountain. You could say it, it's okay. Just like in Hebrew, in the Bible, it says so, for example, when Eliezer comes with his 10 camels to find a wife for Isaac, he comes and he stands on the well. Now, you don't stand with 10 camels on a well. It's impossible. So on in biblical Hebrew means next to. Al ha'ayin is next to. So under could be next to. In the biblical Hebrew, it works. However, the Talmud says, let's stop for a second and let's read this verse literally. They were under the mountain. How were they under the mountain? Right, that's what the verse says. The verse says they were under the mountain. Says the Talmud, God raised Mount Sinai, and he basically said, if you accept the Torah, wonderful. If not, I'm going to just drop the mountain on your head and you will be buried. That's what the Talmud says. In a minute, we'll try to elaborate and explain what that means, but that's what the Talmud says. In other words, the Talmud says it's not a real acceptance because we have some lawyers on the call. Even in Jewish law, a coerced sale or coerced accepting of anything has no legal value. So the Jewish people could have came to God years later and say, sorry, it's the deal's off. We never really accepted it. He says, what do you mean? You accepted? You said you're going to Na'aseh v'nishma, you're going to accept, you're going to do, and then you're going to listen. And then you're going to do, and then you're going to listen, meaning first you're going to do, then you're going to study. They're going to say, sorry, it was coerced. You had a gun to our head. So let's read the Talmud. Says the Talmud as follows. The Gemara cites additional homiletic interpretations on the topic of the revelation at Sinai. The Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp and they met God. Now see the bold. And they stood. Okay, the translation is mistranslating. It's an interpretation out of translation. Here they translate it. And they stood at the lowermost part of the mount. That is not what it says in the Bible. In the verse, they're just doing it because you can't say what the verse says. If you want to see the Hebrew, Vayityatzvu betachtit. Tachat is under, in the under of the mountain. Okay? So what do you do with this verse? So the Talmud says, Rabbi Avdimi bar Chama bar Chasa. This Talmudic sage, Avdimi, the son of Chama, the son of Chasa, said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. And the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent. If not, there will be your burial. Rav Acha bar Yaakov said, from here, there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. Any Jew, you can get off the hook. God says, how come we didn't keep the Torah? Sorry, I have no obligation. Why not? The Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah. And it is therefore not binding. So that's the story. We got the Torah at the Sinai. We celebrate that on the holiday of Shavuot. Okay, you got the Torah, but you can always get out of it because it was coerced. Okay, before we even continue about Purim, the commentaries say, what are you talking about? Why would God force the Jewish people with the mountain on top of their head and say you're going to be buried if you don't accept the Torah? The Jewish people were perfectly ready and perfectly willing to accept the Torah. Why the need to coerce them? That is the question that the commentaries in the Talmud asks. The most famous one who asked that is the Tosafot. We discussed the Tosafot yesterday. I think it was yesterday, and we had a whole discussion about the Tosafot. No, 2 days ago on Tuesday. But Tosafot is the commentary on the Talmud, Rashi's grandchildren and their yeshivas and their schools, printed on the page of the Talmud. So what do you mean? Why does God have to coerce them? And the answer is as follows. The answer is that it doesn't mean literally. It doesn't mean that God said, if you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to bury you here. That's not what it means. In Jewish literature, certainly in Hasidic literature, mountain represents love. Because you have the plain, the ground, the plain. And then when the earth goes upward, that is what a mountain is. So the earth yearning to go up is the metaphor of a mountain. So when it says that God held the mountain over their head, basically what it means is God overwhelmed them with love. He took them out of Egypt. He performed the 10 plagues. He split the sea. He's showering them with love. Now when he says, do you want the Torah? They're forced to say yes, right? Somebody is sort of giving you, doing so much for you on the moment. You have no choice but to say yes, because you're overwhelmed by the force of love. That's the way the commentaries explain this Talmud. If he forced them at the mountain, you're going to be buried under the love, meaning you'll be overwhelmed by the love. So at Sinai, you ask the Jewish people, do you really have a realistic way of saying no after God did so much for you? No, whatever God says, we'll do. He did so much for us. We have to reciprocate. But do they really want to accept the Torah? No. So that's how the Talmud says, and that's how the Talmud is reinterpreted by the Talmudic commentators to explain why God would actually hold the mountain over their head. They say it doesn't mean literally; it means showering them with love. And you overwhelm someone with love, and they say they want to do it. They don't really want to do it, right? It's a problem as parents. You give your children so much, and sometimes they want to do what you want to do. They want to do what you want to do to please you because they feel indebted. And they're not always saying it what they really want to do. So it's very difficult. It's very important to make sure that when your child tells you that they want something, that they really want it, and they're not saying it just because they feel that that's what you want and you're showering them with love. Not that they shouldn't do what you want, but I'm just saying you have to know where, in other words, you have to be cognizant of this concept. So that is the story why the accepting the Torah if we just got the Torah at Sinai, we can always get out of the deal. You just hire a good lawyer, they'll look at the contract and say, sorry, there was coercion here. Later, the Talmud is going to continue. All that changed in Persia at the story of Purim. Go ahead, Barry.
How would one acknowledge the acceptance? In other words, what would be necessary for Hashem to know that it was accepted or not accepted?
Well, the Jewish people at Sinai said, Moshe came to them and said, here's the Torah. They said, Na'aseh v'nishma. Everything that Hashem said, we will do, and then we will hear, meaning we will do, and then we will study. So they accepted it. So there's no question that they accepted it. The question is legally, is that acceptance binding upon them and their children if it was out of coercion? However, in a minute, you'll see in Persia, they accepted it not by saying anything verbally, but by their actions. And sometimes actions speak louder than words. Right? And even legally, there's an interesting discussion. So for example, let's say I buy something. And I get home and I realize that the advertising was false. It's not exactly what I wanted. So in Talmudic law, it's not exactly as advertised. In Talmudic law, I can go back to the seller and I could exchange it. I can get my money back. However, if I use the item, then it's too late. Because your actions indicate that you agree to this inferior product, and therefore you can't return it. So in other words, I'm just trying to say that even in the law, in Jewish law, actions sometimes speak louder than words. And therefore, when the Jewish people accepted the Torah when they had no incentive to do so, to the contrary, all the coercion was for them to leave, and they stuck around, that's when they really accepted Torah, as we'll get to the Talmud in a second. Go ahead, Roberta.
Yeah, how do you know that they didn't really want to accept the Torah at that point, that they didn't embrace it?
We don't know. That's what the Talmudic sage says. He doesn't say they didn't want to. He says, there could be, if somebody wants to wiggle out of the obligation, they could always claim. We don't know what they claim, even if they wanted to. That's the depth of the Talmudic, the interpretation of the Talmud, which is even if they wanted to, of course they wanted to. They wanted to, but it was affected by external circumstances. right? Of course they wanted to, but it wasn't their own will. It was sort of being imposed because God is showering them with love. So they have no choice but to say yes. So the short answer is, I just gave two answers, which are a little bit contradictory, but it's Purim, so it's okay. No, but the short answer is, yeah, it doesn't mean that they didn't. It means that a person can always wiggle out of the obligation. There's always a claim. You can always make that claim. We don't know, but the reality is that you're right. At Purim, we discover that the original claim maybe was accurate, but we'll get into that later. I mean, I have to think about that. But the bottom line is, yeah, we're not saying that it was not genuine. We're saying there could be a claim that it wasn't genuine. We don't know. I mean, we don't know what's going on in people's hearts. They said they want to. Of course, they said they want to. God forced them. Either you read the Talmud literally, which is God forced them, he's going to kill them if they don't keep the Torah, which is strange because it's strange to read it that way, but it's the part of Talmud that's not the law. It's the Medrash in the Talmud, so it doesn't have to be literal. So the commentaries explain it means that God overwhelmed them with miracles, overwhelmed them with love, took them out of Egypt. If you take me out of slavery and say, do me a favor, could you take my shirt to the cleaners? You have a choice, but you don't really have a choice because you have no choice. I did so much for you. Of course, you're going to say yes. Do you really want to do it? No, but you have no choice, right? Not because you have no choice. Technically, you have a choice, but emotionally and psychologically, you don't have a choice. So could you say, you really enjoy this? No, you do it because you have no choice. Does that help? Or am I just repeating myself in different ways? Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, how does this piece of Talmud reflect on the golden calf?
The golden calf works perfectly because you see that when the moment they had something went wrong, they went back to their old ways. That you see that it wasn't internalized. The acceptance wasn't internalized, and that's why at the first opportunity they ran away.
Right. So that wasn't that much of a sin then.
Yeah. So look, the Jews are always good defense lawyers, and already the rabbis are very good defense lawyers. If you need a defense lawyer, hire the rabbis. Moshe told God right away. There's all kinds of ways to get out of the golden calf. For example, the 10 Commandments are written in the singular. God says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. But in Hebrew, there's your singular and your plural. You don't have that in English, but you have that in Hebrew. In the 10 Commandments, it says your singular. So why your singular? Because God is speaking to every single Jew. I'm not just one of 15 million people. God is speaking to you as an individual. However, Moshe is a good defense attorney. He tells God, sorry, you never commanded them against the golden calf. You only commanded me. You spoke in the singular. They thought you're talking to me. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways to get out. And I can assure you that Moshe was able to do it, and that's why he got the forgiveness. But the question really is did the Jewish people accept the Torah? Is it morally binding upon us if we never really accepted it? We accepted it out of coercion. So that's the problem with the acceptance of the Torah at Sinai. Talmud continues here, and that's why we're talking about it today. Says the Talmud, Rava said, even so, meaning nevertheless, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh. Oh, so now there's no, we the post the Purim story, sorry, you can't get out of the obligation and say, I didn't really want the Torah, God forced me. Nobody forced you at the time of Purim. No one forced our ancestors, that is. So they could have said, okay, we don't want to be Jewish, and the decree will not apply to them, and then all the incentives are for them to leave. Nevertheless, they stuck around. That is the acceptance. Their words, like Barry pointed out, they accepted it by their actions. Where do you see this? And Rava says that as it is written, it's alluded to in the verse of the Scroll of Esther. It doesn't say it literally, but we're going to reinterpret the verse. So the verse says like this: the Jews ordained and took upon them. Bad translation. Kimu, literally, lekayem is to establish. The Jews established and received upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves onto them, meaning all the converts. Meaning the Jewish people, they kimu, they established and they accepted for them, for their children, and anyone who joins them, all the converts, to do the mitzvah of Purim. That's the literal meaning. So the Talmud says 1 second. Rava says 1 second. Why do I need the double expression? They ordained. They established and they accepted. Says the Talmud what it means, and he taught the Jews established what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Sinai. We have a double language. Kimu, they established, vikiblu, not and they received. They established that which they already received before at Sinai. Now they re-accept it. And now they re-accept it, and therefore they okay, and now they accepted it, and therefore now the Torah is binding. So I'm sorry to break the news to you. Now we have no excuse. Now God says, you gotta do my will. We can't say, sorry, it was a coerced sale. Now we're in. But that's not because of the giving of the Torah. That's not really the acceptance of the Torah. The real acceptance of the Torah is in Persia, in the story of Purim, outside of Israel, which is a fascinating phenomenon. Now, this sheds light on a lot of details of the day, which I'm about to get to. But first, Warren, please go ahead.
A very quick question. Now I'm confused. If the Torah,
Warren, it's Purim. That's the whole idea. We don't know.
You've accomplished the purpose. If the
Without
Torah,
alcohol.
If the Torah wasn't necessarily binding, in other words, there were escape clauses prior to Purim, what is the basis for considering the exile in the first place to have somehow been a punishment for failure to abide by the commandments of the Torah?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure the answer. I don't know what Rava would say. I don't know. If I were speaking for Rava, if I had no choice but to speak to Rava, I would say one of two things. Either, okay, what I would say is like this. I would say you could look at there's two ways to look at the exile, the way the Torah itself describes the exile, which means if we don't fulfill God's words, we will be abandoned we'll be thrown out of the land. One is you broke the contract, right? We have a contract. You keep the Torah. If you keep the Torah, you get to live in the land of Israel. If you serve idols, you break the contract and you lose your rights under the contract. That's one way of reading the Torah. It's in the Torah, it's legitimate. However, there is another way of reading the Torah and of reading the story, and it's actually also explicit in the Torah, not so much in the 5th book of the Torah, but mainly in the 3rd book of the Torah, in Leviticus, which is focused on the holiness. And there, the Torah says things like, we actually read it on Yom Kippur, that the Torah says, don't follow the abominations of the people of Canaan, lest the land should not spit you out. And Rashi explains, and others explain, that Israel is a spiritually sensitive land. And if people engage in immorality in Israel, ultimately, it's like the stomach cannot contain food that is spoiled, and the stomach will throw it up and throw it out. The land itself is going to throw you out. In other words, even if you say the contract is not binding upon me, and therefore I'm not deserving of punishment, okay, I'm not deserving of punishment, but I still cannot earn the right to live in Israel unless I am spiritually refined. So in other words, there's other ways to look at the exile. The exile is not, you broke the contract, so you're being punished. No, if you're not worthy of living on the holiness of the land, if you're not consistent with its holiness, it's too sensitive to contain the abomination. Okay, so it could last a few hundred years with idol worship, but after a while, it just can't handle it anymore, and will be expelled. So in other words, the Torah itself gives you reason for expulsion, even without the legal obligation. If I think.
One more quick question.
Go ahead.
How does this fit with the covenant? The covenant in Deuteronomy. I thought my recollection is that there was another covenant.
Yes.
With Moses.
The Jewish people. That's a very good question. That's a good question. I don't know. I have to think about it. You're saying the Jewish people are already at the brink of entering the land of Israel. They weren't at Sinai yet. That's a good question. And I have homework. Thank you. Thank you for giving me homework. That's a good question. I'll have to look into it. Go ahead, Barry.
Whatever you do, Rabbi, you should permanently incorporate that hat into your wardrobe. It's great on you.
Then everyone's going to think there's a Hebrew song that they sung kids. They have a whole song in Israel where they sing, how come, I forgot already the tune, but it's not coming to me right now, that how come there's not Purim every day? So it's not Purim every day. What are you going to do? Okay, let's go back to thinking about what does this have to do with us today? In other words, how we celebrate Purim. So again, now what we just established is that Purim is not just a day where we celebrate the simple interpretation, which is we celebrate the physical redemption from a plot to destroy the Jews. Of course, it's that too. By the way, this explains why you have a difference between Hanukkah and Purim. And Hanukkah was also a time that we were saved. We went to war against a superpower. Bad idea. It's always a tricky idea to go to war. It's certainly the strongest army. The single superpower of the time was the Greek army. You couldn't do undefeated. And we go to a guerrilla battle against a superpower, and we evict them of the land of Israel. Unbelievable miracle. Yet, how did the sages establish that we should celebrate the holiday? I hate to break anybody's idea of Judaism, but the whole idea of eating latkes and the whole idea of eating jelly donuts is a custom that evolved later. The sages say the way you celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah, is by lighting candles, singing songs of praise to God. We say Hallel. Candles is fine, but candles is not as tangible as Purim. Purim, we have to make a feast. You have to drink wine, right? So why the different ways of celebrating? So the sages explain, Hanukkah, okay, we went to war too, but what were we fighting for? We were fighting for religious freedom. So it's a spiritual idea. So we celebrate it in a spiritual way, which is candles. Purim, what was at stake? Stake is our physical survival. And therefore, who gets to celebrate? Not the soul, the body, because the body is the chief recipient of the decree as well as the redemption, right? Haman was, in some sense, Haman wanted to kill everybody, and it was the physical body, as opposed to the Greeks. They said, we have nothing against the Jews. The Jews can remain Jews. In other words, they can remain alive as long as they accept our culture. So it was really a spiritual battle. So all I'm trying to say is Purim, of course, Purim is primarily, Purim has the dimension. The external idea of Purim is the dimension of the physical salvation. This physical celebration, there's no question about that. But what the Talmud here is telling us, that there's so much more. It's also a very deep spiritual day. It's a day where we celebrate the idea, not just the day. The day is the culmination of that era, is when we accepted the Torah, and the Torah is binding. Okay, fine. Now let's see how that affects the customs of the day. So we know that Purim, there are 4 commandments, rabbinic commandments. It's not biblical holiday. The 4 rabbinic commandments. What are the 4 rabbinic commandments? So first of all, we read the Megillah. We read the story. If you want to hear the Megillah, you didn't hear it, text me. We'll get somebody to come to read the Megillah for you before nightfall. Then we also have the mitzvah called Matanot Le'Avyonim, to give money to the poor. So the technicality of the mitzvah, you want to give at least 2 coins to at least 2 poor people, because it's in the plural. It says gifts to the poor. Both are in the plural. So you give 2 charities, you give a few coins, 2 coins, a minimum of 2 coins to each of the charities. That's the second mitzvah. Third mitzvah is to send gifts of food, mishloach manot, send gifts of food to a friend. Here, if you want to get into technicalities, 2 gifts, in other words, 2 food items to 1 friend. It says mishloach, sending is singular, manot, portions, plural. So with the poor, you want to give 2 poor people at least 2 coins. With the food, you want to give 2 dishes to 1 person, at least 2 dishes to 1 person. Of course, it involves this whole thing where everybody gives all their friends. It's a nightmare. Growing up, if you have a few children and they have a few kids in their class and everybody wants to give to everybody, you spend your whole day running around in the food delivery business. But that's just to involve too far. Maimonides says, if you want to increase, don't increase in sending gifts of food, increase in the charity. That's what Maimonides says, for the record. So that's just by the off topic. And then, of course, is a feast. So that's the 4 mitzvot. So here we have a beautiful interpretation from the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, let's look at the holiday and say, where do we commemorate the fact? All the commemorations that I mentioned is just connected to the story of the salvation of the body. Where do you commemorate the fact that we actually accepted the Torah again? This would be something in the holiday that emphasizes this point, that now we accept the Torah on our own will. Where do you see that? Because everything I mentioned is associated with the physical celebration. You want to send food for the poor people so they could, money for the poor people so they could celebrate. You want to send gifts of food so people can increase their holiday festivities. And of course, the meal is a physical meal. And reading the story is reading of the story of the salvation. How come we don't make any commemoration of the fact that the Jewish people themselves accepted the Torah? And the Rebbe says we do. Where do you see it? When you're obligated, you do just what is commanded. When you want to do it on your own will and your own volition, that's when you do more than is required. Says the Rebbe, if you look at these 4 mitzvot, they are all designed in a way that it's more than the usual. So we'll look at the Torah as the standard, and what the rabbi said, do more than the Torah's obligation. So where do you see this? So let's start with the reading of the Megillah. So reading of the Megillah is not that unusual in Judaism, because every Shabbat we get together and read the Torah. In fact, not only Shabbat, we also read the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, because the Talmud says, Ezra the scribe said that we should not have 3 days without hearing the Torah. So we read the Torah all the time. So reading the scroll, the story of Esther, is not unusual. However, there is something unusual about the scroll of Esther, and that is that we read it at night and at day. We read it twice on Purim. We don't read the Torah Friday night and Shabbat day. We only read it Shabbat day. But on Purim, we're going to go beyond the norm. The Jewish people are going to say, when we're going to celebrate Purim, we're going to do a double portion. Not only will we read the story during the day, the way we always read on every holiday and festival and Shabbat, we read the Torah during the day. We're also going to read it Purim night, which was last night. What does that show? We're going beyond because we really want to do this. Now, charity. Charity is a mitzvah all year long. However, technically, there's different forms of charity, but technically, there's no obligation for me to give charity today. There's no obligation for me to give charity today. I have to give a certain amount of my produce, certain amount of my produce, whether it applies to income biblically or rabbinically. We're not going to get into that right now, but I can give at the end of the year. I don't have to give charity today. When do I have to give charity today? If there's a need arises before me, if someone knocks on my door and says, please, I need help, that's when the obligation to give charity immediately kicks in. Otherwise, I could speak to my accountant and I could give at the end of the year or whatever the case is. But there's no mitzvah to give charity in a very specific day, unless there's a need, unless a poor person comes and seeks you out. Then you have to give charity. Purim is the only day of the year that you have to go and seek out the poor. You have to find the poor person and go give them charity. So you're going beyond. Now it's Purim, so I'll say a joke. Okay.
Wait, Rabbi, I have a question. Can I just ask a question about charity? And then I want to hear your joke because I love your jokes.
Hope I don't forget it.
Right. Isn't it like insulting? It's like saying like you're poor and like I chose you as one of my 2 people to give charity to. Like, why does it have to be the person's poor? Can't it be just that like maybe someone has less than you?
We'll get to that in a minute. That's the next mitzvah of sending gifts to your friends, right? That's a unique mitzvah. Usually the mitzvah of giving charity is to someone who's poor, someone who's in need. But here, there's usually never a mitzvah to give charity, just to send lunch to your friend. Your friend has plenty of lunch by himself. They don't need your lunch. But there's a separate mitzvah, sending gifts of food. And that is not because the other person is in need. That is because the other person just to encourage friendship, right? I don't need your lunch, but I send you. I don't need your bottle of wine, but I send it to you, and you don't need mine, and you send it to me. So that just creates friendship, even though there's.
But how do you find 2 poor people that like?
The short answer is that's what my joke was about.
I'm in Florida right now. I don't know poor people here. Like I don't even know who to go to give.
So the short answer is that I give to charities that know poor people. I don't give directly. I give to charities. I give one to poor people in Crown Heights and one to poor people in Israel. So that's the way I would do it to fulfill the obligation. But stay here because you got to hear my joke, because the joke is so there's a joke about a class of people very religious and very orthodox, but they're very into keeping the letter of the law, but they're not so much into keeping the spirit of the law. So the guy is worried a whole year because he has to do the obligation to give the poor. The problem is, how do you know who's poor? And maybe he's poor, but he's not poor enough to be considered poor enough to be classified as legally poor, to be able to fulfill the obligation to fulfill the obligation to give the poor on Purim. So this guy's very concerned. So the joke is, or maybe it's a true story, probably is a true story if it happened or not. The joke is that he hears of a poor person. He goes and he investigates, finds a poor person. He goes and he gives the guy $2. That's what it says, 2 coins to a poor person. He's so happy. He comes back to the synagogue. No one has ever seen this guy so happy. They say, Yankel, why are you so happy? He says, what do you mean? Finally, I found the person confirmed. The guy has nothing in the refrigerator, absolutely poor. He's certainly in that category, the poorest guy I ever met. And you know what? I was able to give him money and I fulfilled my obligation to give charity to the poor. So his friend says, really? Tell me who the guy is. I also want to fulfill my obligation to give charity to the poor. He says, no. I got to save it for next year. So next Purim, I can give him. So I want to make sure he's poor. So I'm not telling anybody about him. So that's the joke, because of course, you fulfill the obligation, but you miss the spirit of the law, which is to help people. But you get the point. You get the joke only came about because yes, it's an obligation to seek out people who are poor on Purim. And the rest of the year, yes, you have to give charity, but I don't have to give charity today, Thursday. Today wasn't Purim. Yesterday, there's no obligation to give charity on a specific day, unless somebody comes and asks you, says, I'm in need, could please help me? Then you have an obligation to help. How much to help is another question, but you have an obligation. But Purim is, today is the day. Go seek out somebody. Like I said, Erica's question is, if you don't know somebody, give it to a charity that knows people, and that's what I do. And that's, I don't really give to it. I give to charities that, not just institutions, but in other words, people that actually are hands-on on the ground, people that I know that actually help people with things like vouchers for food. So that's what I do, but I'm sure everyone knows their charities. But the bottom line is, all I'm trying to say is it's beyond, so we have a standard obligation in Judaism to give charity, but Purim, it's beyond that. It's seek out the poor. Now let's get to the third mitzvah, which is the mitzvah we just mentioned, to send gifts of food to your friend. That's certainly not in the Torah. Nowhere in the Torah is there a mitzvah to give food to somebody who has food. What would be the point, right? No, Purim, we're going beyond. We're saying even someone who has food, you want to increase friendship between people. Everybody should send gifts of food to the other person. That's not found in the Torah. And the feast, which is found in the Torah, every holiday there's a mitzvah to celebrate and have a feast. Yes. But look the way the rabbis make the feast. Now we're going back full circle. The rabbi said, joy has to be unbound to the point where you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai, whatever that means. We'll discuss that later, maybe if we have time. But the point here is it's clear that they're going beyond the norm and beyond the obligation of all holidays. What does that help us? Says the Rebbe, this shows that we're celebrating the idea that now Judaism is a new model. We're not doing Judaism because God forced us to. If we did it only because God forced us to, then we only do whatever he told us. We don't seek to increase and do more. It's like if I have an obligation, I just do what I have to. But if I do it because I want to, then I come back and I do more than the obligation. And it doesn't have to be a lot more, but it's got to be more than the obligation, right? Everyone knows the metaphors. I don't have to repeat it. Your spouses, if you do whatever you're supposed to do for your spouse, that's not enough. If you do just a little bit more that you don't have to do, even if it's not significant, that makes the difference. So if you pay the mortgage, that doesn't count. But if you buy flowers or if you buy whatever your husband likes, a coffee, okay, that's something. Why? That makes no sense. I paid the mortgage. The mortgage is much more expensive than a bouquet of flowers. Yeah, but the mortgage is what you have to. It doesn't count. It doesn't express that you really want to do it, that you really invested in the relationship. If you go beyond, even if it's small, but you're going beyond beyond the obligation, that represents that you actually want to gift. And that's why every mitzvah of the 4 mitzvot is designed in a way to go more than the Torah standard obligation. And the reason for that is this is the Rebbe's interpretation, because we're commemorating something different. We're not commemorating just the salvation, then we would just do the standard, have a meal, hear the story during the day, and if you happen to see a poor person that needs help with the food, you can give him some money. No, we designed this holiday to be in a way that we go beyond the norm. We'll read the Megillah twice. We'll seek out the poor person. We'll send gifts of food to people who don't need it. But we're still going to just encourage a friendship, and we're going to celebrate, but not just like any holiday, but beyond any holiday. And that represents the fact that we want to not just pay the mortgage, but we want to buy the flowers, or any other metaphor. I'm just sort of, I can't think creatively of what other metaphors are. But the bottom line here is do a little bit more. That's then the obligation, and that's when the relationship becomes meaningful, and that's what we celebrate. So this is point number one. We'll take a few questions, and then we'll do a few minutes about the wine. What is this business? What does it help not to know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, which is totally strange, and why it doesn't seem like a good thing at all, and why we tell this to our kids. But we have to try, I guess, to figure this out. Or maybe not, because it's Purim. We got to go beyond the knowledge. But okay, we'll talk about that. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, my question was about why did we accept Torah in Shushan? So
Yeah.
it's maybe partially the answer to Warren's question, because not everything is black and white, because Hashem can either force you or create a scenario when you kind of is led to accept. And that's what we are struggling with every day too. So it's more like a philosophical question, because we are still accepting Torah every day in a way.
So that's a very deep question. There's different ways to tackle it, and you probably tackle it differently every day of the year. In other words, there's different dimensions. Let me try one way. And this helps Warren's question too, because Warren's question was, so why how are we held accountable and for the exile if we never really accepted it? So I think what we're saying here is like this: the Jewish people, why did they accept it at the Torah, in Persia at this time of Purim? Because they really, really wanted to. Deep down, that's their true core. They feel the most comfortable when they're connected to God. So when all else, when you got rid of, so later we reveal that the Jewish person really is committed to God and really does want the relationship. So why did they accept it? Because that's coming from them. That's who they are. We are people who value the relationship with God, even at the expense of risking our life. We value it so much that we're willing to risk our life for it, because that is who we are. We have a part of God within us. So our core and our essence wants to bond with God. Okay. The problem is we're not always in touch with that inner core. And therefore, on a regular day, you tell me, no, do you want to say, would you rather do what God wants or do what you want? I say, I want to do what I want. Say, but God told you must listen to him. Yeah, but I was forced. I had no choice. So in other words, that's on the level of conscious. The conscious level on a regular day, I say, I don't know if I want to do this. But at my core, I always accepted it. I always wanted to do God's will, because that's who I am. And I'm one with God, and therefore my soul is one with God. And therefore, part of my soul always wants to connect to God. The problem is that the issue here is sometimes the circumstances are the ones who reveal my core, my essence. Now, I don't want to get into this, but actually, the last discourse that the Rebbe distributed, I shouldn't go here because it's beyond the scope of the next 9 minutes. The Rebbe has a whole discourse trying to figure out, how do I get in touch with my core when there's no external pressure? And that is even a greater level than Purim. And that's really the story, not of Persia, but of the United States. We're in the free country, where there's no external pressure to Judaism. And if I remain loyal to Judaism in the United States, in the lands in the free countries, that is actually a greater acceptance of the Torah than even the story of Purim. And the reason why it's not in the Talmud, because we don't have a Talmud writing about this era. But really, the Rebbe says there's 3 stages. There's the stage of accepting the Torah at Sinai, which you can complain about and say, well, you're coerced. There's the stage of accepting the Torah because of in Persia, but then you could say, yeah, but external circumstances forced you to reveal your essence. The Rebbe said there were a lot of Jews, a lot of Hasidim that he was talking to, were sitting right in front of him, that in Russia, they risked their life for Judaism, to teach Judaism, literally, not figuratively, literally day in, day out for decades. Then they came to the United States, and now you don't see that same passion. Where did the passion go? The answer is, Well, when you have external pressures, sometimes that actually allows you to touch your core. Without the external pressures, you don't always have that. So the Rebbe says, if you can produce that level of commitment to God that you had in the Soviet Union, risking your life for Judaism, if you can reproduce that in the lands of in the free country, then you actually have a greater degree of commitment to God than Purim. So that's, I shouldn't be talking about some Purim because we're saying something beyond Purim. But Purim is the start of the process when we do it because we want to. And sometimes the external pressure gets us to ask us the question of, when our life is on the line, that's when we ask the question, who are you? What do you really want? Okay, right? And sometimes you say, I don't think about those questions on a day-to-day basis, but if I can express that commitment on a regular day in the free country, that's even a greater acceptance. So I don't want to go into this too much, but there are many metaphors and examples to explain, but I just put it out there. Okay, so that's the story. Basically, what we said in the last 53 minutes is that we have the idea that Purim, we accepted the Torah because of our own existence, not only because our own will, not only because it was coerced, and the way we commemorate that and the way we celebrate that is by showing God that what we're going to commit is beyond the obligation. If we just do exactly what God wants, that's coerced. I'm here because I signed a contract. Now, maybe I can get out of the contract, maybe I can't, but either way, I'm just doing what the contract says. When it comes to the point that I accept it upon myself and there's no external pressure, because all external pressure, as we said, all external pressure is the opposite. All the incentives are here to get me out of the deal. All the incentives are to drop the Torah, and nevertheless, I remain committed to God. That means I'm committed to God, not because God forced me either by overwhelming me with love, but because this is who I really am. This is what I want to do. And if it's what I want to do, then every obligation we're going to do throughout this day is going to be doubled. In other words, beyond the norm, to show that we're doing it not because we have to, but because we want to. So that's the summary up to this point. Now we have 6 minutes to deal with the drinking of the wine, which, as you see, I'm trying to delay it because I think subconsciously I'm trying to avoid it. But at the end of the day, you can only push it and postpone so much. Eventually, you have to deal with tough issues. So here we are. So let's start with the obligation. I mentioned the obligation. The Talmud says, well, you have to drink to the point that you don't know between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. That's the Talmud. Now, throughout the years, the sages weren't too happy with this. Jews don't like to get drunk, or the rabbis don't like when the Jews get drunk. So there's all kinds of ways of reading it and negating it. So, for example, in the Code of Law, the Code of Law quotes the Talmud. And the Code of Law was written, it's basically by a Sephardic rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who lived in Sfat in the 16th century. But then there were comments on the Code of Law by the Ramah Moshe Israelish, who was the chief rabbi of Krakow. And when he got the Code of Law from Israel, so at first he was a little bit upset, because not upset, he was a little discouraged because he spent years trying to make his own Code of Law. And here he was surpassed by the Code of Law from Israel. So all his years of work were really for naught. So at first he was concerned, but then he realized that the Code of Law is actually written based on the Sephardic custom. So we have what to add. The Ashkenazi community has some differences of opinion. So he wrote what he wrote glosses, comments on the Code of Law. They're printed together. Every Code of Law has both, and that's where he puts in the Ashkenazi custom. So just to be poetic, the Code of Law is called Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, meaning to say everything is prepared for the meal. You want to study the Talmud and you want to derive the law from the Talmud. That's like going to the kitchen and baking the soup, making the food. It's a lot of work. You have to go in, you have to find the ingredients, you have to find out how much, and it's very difficult to derive the law from the Talmud. But if you come to the Code of Law, it's all set at the table. It's like coming to a meal. All you have to do is eat the prepared food. So if the Code of Law is a table, then the comments are, of course, what are the comments? The tablecloth. So he calls it a mappa, a tablecloth on the table. But in any case, when he reads this law, he says, some people say you don't have to drink so much. What you should do is drink a little bit more than you're accustomed to until you get tired. When you're tired, you go to sleep. And when you go to sleep, you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. In other words, you don't have to do the obligation literally by getting so drunk to the extent that you can't differentiate between Haman and Mordechai, but drink a little bit more, you get a little headache, go take a nap, and then you fulfilled your obligation. So it's basically an obligation to take a mid-afternoon nap on Purim. Okay, that is a little easier if you're not excited about the drunk option. Okay, so that's what to do in practice. But what value? Why would it be a good thing not to know the difference between blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman? Why is that a good thing? In fact, I mean, it makes no sense. The whole party, we're sitting and commemorating the downfall of Haman and the triumph of Mordechai, meaning representing the Jews. And now you say the result of this great celebration would be that you cannot differentiate between the two. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So there are all kinds of ways of explaining it. Because I'm biased, I'm a Chassid, so I'm going to follow the Chassidic tradition. I'll give you the Chassidic interpretation. So the Chassidic interpretation says like this: you have to the joy has to be so profound that you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Meaning the difference between good and bad, between Mordechai and Haman, is not based on knowledge alone. You can't know the difference. You want to go to a place where your commitment to good comes from your core, from your essence, not from your knowledge, not from your understanding, because understanding is a wonderful thing, but that's not who you really are. There's deeper than what I understand, right? For example, I understand that broccoli is good. It doesn't mean I'm going to eat it, right? There's something deeper. There's the will, there's the devotion and commitment that runs deeper than knowledge. So when we say all year long, you serve God through knowledge. Why am I doing the right choice? Because it makes sense to me. I understand that this is the life I want to live. That's knowledge. Purim is the day that you go beyond the knowledge. Why am I doing the right thing? Why do I believe that Mordechai is blessed? Not because of my knowledge. Knowledge, I put my knowledge to sleep. I don't know the difference between knowledge itself is not what differentiates between Haman and Mordechai. Why do I do the right thing? Why am I committed to God? Because this is who I am. This is my core. This is what I really want. Much deeper than knowledge. It's a devotion that's deeper than knowledge, which really parallels what we've been saying all the time, that the Jewish people in the time of Esther, they had all the incentives to abandon God, and they didn't because that was their true core. They discovered that's what they really want. So to tap into that feeling, we say, go beyond the understanding. It's not about understanding. All year long, investigate and understand the difference between good and evil and Haman and Mordechai and morality and what's moral and what's not, and why you like the moral side, you don't like the immoral side. It's wonderful. All year long, you should be built on knowledge. But once a year, you have to go beyond knowledge. Celebrate the commitment to God. It's not predicated on my understanding. What is it predicated on? A deeper bond, my core. This is who I am. This is what I want to do. And that's what we give space on Purim to celebrate it. So the point is not that I should not know that Haman is evil. The point is that I'm repulsed by the evil of Haman, not because my knowledge tells me, but because my essence tells me that. And that is the opportunity of Purim to get in touch with who we really are. So that's what we're going to do. The way you do that is joy and celebration. So l'chaim, thank you everybody for joining. I have here the vodka espresso. I really want to do this, but instead it's going to be later in the day when I finish driving. In the meantime, it's just a regular coffee. So l'chaim, have a wonderful, happy Purim, and only the joy of Purim should last and spill over for the rest of the year, and we should hear only good news. Thank you for joining.
That,